the challenges we face right now, most of you know it takes 10 to 15 years to develop a medication, sometimes costing as much as $2 billion. And you can see, the compound selection process yields about a 50%, at the end of the day, about a 50% approval in the phase 3. So it's a huge investment, a big risk, and in many cases, it makes it less appealing to investors. Especially if you're a young startup getting something right out of university, it's harder because they understand this. They understand the likelihood of success and the challenges you face, maybe even more than you do if you are, a new person leaving or emerging with a compound out of university. And that risk aversion that you see evolving really is poignant. This is a book I'm recommending that you read. It's a quick read. It's a biography of Maurice Hileman. He worked at Merck. I worked at Merck. That was my last assignment before I moved here with my husband 10 years ago and started my own companies. But he did some great stuff. And when you read this book, there's a couple things that will come to mind. One, you will recognize that as time changes, we become more sensitive and more aware of how to include vulnerable populations in clinical trials. So some of it you may say, wow, we would never do that today, and you might then say, good thing, we might not never do that today. But some of it you might say, wow, pharmaceutical companies don't take those same kind of risks anymore. A lot of decisions are made by a cross-functional group where it's much easier to say no to a proposed compound than it is to say yes. And some of the things that this team was able to do were really more like Merck said, carte blanche. It's your idea, we'll fund it, run with it. And so there is a measure of, at least when I read this book, of thinking, I wonder what we're missing by watering down our risk tolerance so much in the industry. So that's just a personal point of view. I hope you do read the book. It's a fun read, very interesting. But it leads me to the sort of next challenge that we face. The costs of the trials are going up. Here we are trying to innovate, trying to create more streamlined processes and electronic data capture, but the trial prices are going up. And that's because it's sort of a circular situation where we do work. It's in a limited population based on our entry criteria. We get through the approval process, we launch the product, it goes to a much wider audience, and the exposure time is extended, so we learn more. So on the market is sometimes when we're learning more about the safety of a compound. So when we have that kind of feedback, we start to lengthen our trials, we start to make our trials more extensive because we really do want to know everything we can possibly know and make sure good decisions are being made about new products coming to market. So costs are rising, complexity is more demanding, and we continue to have difficulty with enrollment, which drives the prices of our trials up. That then implies additional costs to the overall big picture of drug development, which is not sustainable. And so this is really one of the biggest challenges. So in addition to that, and we'll get to how pharma is responding to those challenges in a moment, but in addition to that, the period of exclusivity without a competitor on the market is getting smaller and smaller. So, you have this big investment, this huge amount of time, you have a shorter period to recoup and reinvest, and there are fewer and fewer opportunities for the blockbuster med. So blockbuster is a $1 billion a year med. In my career, at the very beginning, everything was a blockbuster. Not the case these days. Most of those sort of major pathways for common diseases are mined, and many of the blockbusters have gone off patent, and so it's important to understand what does that mean for the industry. One additional challenge. So I just put this one in again for humor too. So the patent cliff, we faced it, still hanging on for life in many ways relative to the blockbusters. I don't know if that's a trick or if it's
I can't do it.
real. Those who can, raise your hands. If you can do it. No, okay, so what does it mean? What are we doing? So I think it was mentioned at my table that pharma is starting to de-risk in a different way. They're not going after novel compounds right away and taking them through all of those early stage efforts, they're actually looking for compounds that have been somewhat de-risked. They're looking at these small startup companies that have lower costs, that have faster development, and that can de-risk in the early phase, then licensing those in where they're best and in doing the hefty financial work that are the larger trials. So you're seeing that as one response. And I guess this is not a response. This is continued discussion of the challenges. Obviously, we continue to have challenges with actually implementing the trials, and I might be remiss if I go through every little detail here. Some of you who work on clinical trials understand those limitations. So it brings me to where do we go from here? This is another reading assignment for you. This is a great book. It doesn't have anything to do with business or the pharmaceutical industry at all. It is an analysis of who survives when faced with tragedies of war or lost at sea or climbing a mountain and falling with your team and etc. And it really looks at who lives, who dies, and why. And the bottom line is that those who hold on to an existing mental map of what's happening to them and how they're going to proceed without looking at the data around them and readjusting their mental map as to what they need to do, those who do not adjust their mental map do not survive. So I would say this applies to any type of business, and it applies in your personal life as well. If what's happening around you isn't what you expected, you can't forge on pretending it is and still survive. You really have to do that in business as well. So you need to take in the data of the changing times and move forward with a new mental map. And that's what's happening now.